Hi, and welcome to Hull & Hull TV. I'm Suzana Popovic-Montag, the managing partner of Hull & Hull, and I am very pleased to be joined today by Laura Tamblyn Watts and Ian Hull. Laura is the Senior Fellow for the Canadian Centre for Elder Law, and Ian is the co-founding partner of Hull & Hull. Thank you both for joining us here today. What we're going to talk about today is the issue of retirement. And we always hear about this magical age of 65. Laura, where did 65 come from?
It's funny, we do talk about 65, and it's somehow embedded in our narratives, and not just in one country, but around the world we talk about 65. Where it comes from is really quite funny. In the 1800s, Otto von Bismarck actually had won the wars, and the armies came back, and the generals came to him and said, we would like to have a pension, which really was kind of unheard of at that point in any kind of formal, structured way. But he was a wily old guy. And so he asked a couple questions. He asked, what's the average age of death? Okay, so it was about 42 to 44. But if you made it past the first 5 years of life, you were probably going to live into your early 60s, call it about 60. And then he asked, what's the oldest person we have in the military right now? And the answer was 67. So originally, he set the retirement age for a pension at 75. And after 10 years of never paying a single pension to anybody, when times were tough politically, as a front page headline grabber, he reduced the age for retirement pensions in the military to 65. And that was in the 1800s. So it would be a little bit like us being advertised that instead of the retirement age for a pension being, about 127, they've reduced it to just only 103. So the age is nonsense, but it's really changed because our thinking now is that it's a retirement, we should be done work. Except now we really have about a third of our life after that magic age of 65.
That's for sure. And Ian, how about from your perspective, in your practice, what kind of issues do you find come into play when we're dealing with the issue of retirement?
Well, what I use the retirement as a trigger. I mean, my clients have to reconsider their estate planning circumstances after major events. And often people don't see the retirement as one of those triggers. But it is really at that point in time when the most important rethinking has to go on. You're going to have to change your financial affairs. You've thought through how you're going to do the math maybe, or maybe not. You've just retired because you've been forced out. But your estate planning at that time is ideal because it's not the kind of estate planning that gets contentious as easily, because it's not 5 minutes before midnight when you're about to pass away, you're calling the lawyers and having them come to the hospital. And it's thoughtful, but it's just as important, as I say to my clients, it's just as important as when you're about to retire or you retire to rethink things as it is when you get married or when you have kids. Mm-hmm. And so I use it as an important trigger point to my clients to revisit their circumstances.
And just building on that, there's actually emotional triggers that makes retirement much more difficult than getting married and having kids. Usually you're happy when you're having those things happen. With retirement, you may be initially quite happy, but statistics have been looking at the mental health piece, particularly with men. And what we see is that the troughs of mental health are enormously impactful from about 6 months after retirement until about the third year after retirement. And people go into really significant forms of depression, which can look like capacity issues. So what's important is that we do the planning and how we transition. It's interesting. I was at my banker's yesterday, and we were doing the visualization of how much money you need to save. And he said, well, when would you like to retire? I said, wow, I'd like to retire tomorrow. But let's pick 60 as a number. And he thought, because 65 is what they have as their default. And then he said, well, and sort of, when do you think that should end? And they had, 80 or 85. And I said, based on my family and based on my cohort, I think you better be putting 97 to 100 in there. They were quite taken aback.
Well, it is, the whole institutional reaction to the expanded age that we're going to move into is, I think, is dinosaur-like, and I've never really totally understood it, because really at the end of the day, that is where the forward thinking should be coming from. Because unless we have that from an institutional standpoint, governments aren't going to address these issues, and we're not, we're underfunded on elder abuse, we're underfunded on all of these issues that are dropping in like a stone right now into our society. Yet even the institutional side of it are a bunch of, they're just sitting around saying, well, let's just see how the numbers work, and let's get another actuary on it, and see where we can go, and we'll push out a report and not do anything about it. But I think it's interesting too, because people are engaged in their retirement in more sophisticated activities. And where I see in a contentious situation, as I've mentioned in other shows, is that I've got clients that are in retirement that are engaged in contentious litigation with their family. Because of the age gap, you can be 65 and your mom's just died, the assets are finally falling in, and you're fighting with your brothers and sisters who are all in the retirement age. And that brings two really interesting dynamics for me, is that I see people who have actually a little bit too much time in their hands, and the litigation becomes a job for them. And they get engaged at a level that's unhealthy, because they really do want to keep busy. And the other side is they just want to give up because they don't want to touch it, because they're in retirement. They want to be zen. So it's a very different client reaction to contentious and non-contentious matters when you hit these big triggers like retirement.
And we see that this boomer generation is the single most indebted generation that Canada has ever had. And so just building on what you're saying, we're seeing that people who are in retirement will still have mortgages, will still have debt. And sometimes we see some of the investment portfolios that are being proposed to them, high-risk investments, things that will drain assets significantly, like a reverse mortgage, which is, in my respectful view, almost always a really bad idea. And it gets people into situations where they're well and truly outliving their money on the one hand, and they have these very indebted kids barking at the door on the other hand, waiting. So it creates a very difficult conversation with two sets of retired cohorts at play with each other.
That's for sure. Well, we know when it starts, but we're not quite sure, and we don't have that crystal ball to predict when it ends. But we will hopefully keep our fingers crossed and do the best we can. Thank you very much for joining us, Laura. Thank you, Ian. And thank you for joining us here at Holland Hall TV.